Greetings and welcome back to the podcast. This episode we are joined by Mr. Scott Saxberg, President and CEO of Cash Island Corp, a private energy company based in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Prior to founding Cash Island, Mr. Saxberg was a co-founder of Crescent Point Energy, of which he was the president and CEO of from 2003 until 2018. Under his direction, Crescent Point grew from 275 BOE a day in 2001 to 180,000 BOE a day in 2018, distributing over $7.5 billion in dividends and growing to a market capitalization of more than $18 billion. In addition, Mr. Scott Saxberg runs a family office titled Icebook Investments that focuses on direct investments in early-stage startups. Icebook is currently invested in over 12 early-stage companies across a variety of industries, including energy tech, retail, real estate, communications, cannabis, e-gaming, and fertility. Mr. Saxberg's lifelong passion for hockey led him to becoming a co-owner of the NHL hockey team, the Arizona Coyotes, from 2013 until 2017. Mr. Saxberg has been named a E&Y Top 40 Under 40, the 2009 Producer of the Year in Oil Week magazine, and the 2011 Saskatchewan Oilman of the Year. Mr. Saxberg also earned a Bachelor of Engineering degree in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Manitoba. Among other things, we discussed the growth of Crescent Point to an $18 billion market cap company, new creative ventures, and what's next on the horizon. Enjoy. This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. This episode is brought to you by Upgrade Labs. Upgrade Labs offers a comprehensive range of cutting-edge performance and recovery services that have been proven to optimize your health in minutes, not hours. Whether it's accelerating muscle mass and bone density or addressing injury and inflammation, start your experience by booking a free cell health analysis at upgradelabs.com/Calgary. This podcast is brought to you by Energy United. Energy United is an organization with a mission to promote practical energy policy across Canada. Energy United is building a community of Canadians that are passionate about Canada's natural gas and oil industry and are willing to take action. Energy United is driving change on issues that matter, all the way from the carbon tax to the emissions cap. Join Energy United to make a difference at energyunited.ca. Good morning, Mr. Scott Saxberg. Thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
For the listener, you are the CEO of Cash Island nowadays amongst your board positions and other ventures, but you're also a co-founder of Crescent Point Energy a few years ago. But I guess, how would you describe yourself nowadays?
That is a very good question. Entrepreneur, a mentor, an author, kind of the three sort of pieces that I kind of speak to.
And you recently have a new book out titled Those We Carry, Historical Fiction, if I'm correct?
Historical fiction.
Historical fiction.
World War II historical fiction, a heartbreaking love story about those we carry with us that change our lives. And it's inspired by a true story of a Canadian soldier and a young Dutch woman during Second World War, which was my great uncle and three great uncles that are in this book, and Koos Vandenberg from Holland. Yeah.
Also, a quick shout out to Ian Dundas for connecting us. He's been a big supporter of the podcast, so I think I have to give him a quick shout out. So
yeah, he was, and people may not know this, and I can walk into the story, but he was one of our original board members back in 2001. So
I learned that bit of history the other day.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
maybe to go back in time.
Yeah.
How did you get into energy and why?
Yeah, that's a good question. So way back in university, I applied to Sask Oil for a summer job and was fortunate enough to get a summer job in Regina. I grew up in Winnipeg, went to University of Manitoba, and went out there for a summer, worked in the reserve group and reported, I think, upwards somewhere through to Glen Muirick at the time. had a good summer, worked really hard. And then when I graduated, they were posting for jobs and I applied, never heard anything. A lot of times, as a student, companies change their plans and things like that. And my mom actually encouraged me, phone them, like phone follow up. And so I phoned Glenn and said, hey, I thought you were going to hire me. And I put my application in and he said they had changed some things, but let me get back to you. And then I'd never forget it. February 1991, I guess, when I graduated, he phoned me out of the blue and said, hey, we got a job for you. And so I started that July when I graduated, and I replaced a really terrible engineer that thankfully he moved jobs. His name was Neil Roselle at the time. So you can understand the competition level of getting into the oil and gas industry if you have to take over Neil Roselle's job from when he was there. And so he moved on, thankfully, into the Edmonton group at Sask Oil. And I went into a company called Pasqua, which was a non-core asset management company of Sask Oil. So they took their bottom assets and it did all the A&D work for Sask Oil. Glenn Urick and Glenn Carley were the CEO and president of this little company within a company. And so I was super fortunate to start in an industry where I was able to use and access a big company's training and all that stuff, but work in a small company. And so I did all the budgeting, reserves, engineering, signed AFEs. And in fact, my first month I was at Pasqua, I did my first acquisition. I exercised a ROFR on a gas asset up in Notikewin with Kaiser Francis. And it was like $1.5 million deal, and did all the paperwork and closed that transaction in my first couple months working in the oil industry. And so the Pasqua had all these assets from Southeast Saskatchewan all the way to BC. And so Neil beforehand had built this database. He's probably going to laugh. And that pulled all the financials from the company to allow you to kind of look at all the assets differently. And then I sort of based off of that and created different processes around how to look at data. And I learned some really key things in that job. And I did it for 3 years. And we set up companies like Icebook Energy. It's got everybody's oil company. We did deals with Penn West and gave them assets back in the day with Murray Edwards and took back EcoD. And we sold off all these assets until it got to a point where it was down to a few assets, and we rolled that into a company called Northern Reef. And at the time, Neil Smith was working for GLJ, Gilbert Yelson and Young at the time. And they wanted to hire me, but I was the key guy in that whole deal. And so they hired, and Neil Smith was the other key guy who did all the evaluations, and they hired him into that. And then when we sold the company, I got moved in the reserve group, and I felt like it was that time to kind of move on. And I moved to Calgary and got a job with Numac Energy and met some of the most brilliant technical people that I've ever worked with. And I wound up meeting up with Dave Balutis at the time, Steve Dixon, Todd Mazie, who's a good friend of mine, a marketer, and learned a lot as an engineer, looking after Saskatchewan and Southern Alberta. Rich Couliard was the vice president. Got to know him really well. Dan Parliament was the manager. So some great technical people. And then kind of a couple of years went by, and then Glenn Urick and Glenn Carley, who were my bosses in Pasqua, started up a new company called Magen Energy. And they asked me to move on and jump in as the first engineer in that startup. And we were, 300 barrels a day at the time. And so I jumped over there and did all the engineering again, sort of the same thing as my first job. Mm-hmm. And we grew that company from 0 to 10,000 barrels a day, and lived through 1998 and the downturn. I'll never forget that. In those days, you're given like a loan to buy stock. So I got $100,000 loan, as much as my mortgage, and I was making $60,000 a year. And so just before 98, when oil dropped to $10, stock was at $9 stock. I was a millionaire on paper. And I remember getting up in the morning. I just had a new little baby, and looking in the mirror and saying, oh no, you're in it for the big bucks. Like, you want to don't sell. And then 98 happened. We went from $9 to $1 and to almost bankruptcy, to the point where we were meeting week over week which bills to pay. And I remember getting up cold winter February and looking at myself in the mirror and going, don't you ever do that again in your life. Have that opportunity and not sell stock and pay off your mortgage and pay off your debts. And we were right on the cusp, and an asset came out from Newmac that was my former company. And I had evaluated it, and at the time they weren't pumping the wells off. And so there's high fluid levels on the wells, and that was their technical view. And I thought, no, we could easily pump off these wells and put them on production. And so we had put a bid in. We got it for $9 million. It was like 800 barrel a day acquisition, but we needed the money from the banks. And at the time we missed the deadline, like, to close the deal. This is Machen. And Michelle Scott, great guy at Newmac, phoned me up and he was like, hey, I trust you. You guys you worked for us, and we'll give you a few more weeks. And they gave us a couple extra weeks, and we closed the deal, got the money from National Bank, and it saved the company. Basically, we were able to double the production with almost no capital, drilled some great wells. Oil then bounced back to $20. We went through another period of growth. And then in 2001 sold to NC Petrofund. And at that time I was, I'm selling my stock. And so in April of 2001, when we announced the deal and we hadn't closed yet, it wasn't going to close till June, we started up Crescent Point, myself and Dave Balutis. And I bumped into Jason Chadwick, at Rio Alto used to have a conference where they'd sell assets. And it was at this Sounding Lake asset that I really liked, that we'd looked at previously. And so I said, hey, is this available? And he's like, yeah, and put a bid in. And so I put a bid in and they accepted it. And so then I went around town looking to raise money. And we hadn't even closed the Machen deal yet. So I was sort of in the middle. And we were working at the time with Shell Capital, which is a venture fund, Jim Hutchinson, and he's still around you can check out his jazz music. He's kind of like has these side gigs. And I bumped into Paul Colburn. Yes. And Paul and I had worked together at Saskoil. He was a lawyer on our floor. And that's another interesting side note of the floor I was on at Saskoil working for Pasqua had Steve Sugianto, Neil Roselle, Trent Yanko, Reg Greenslate. I'm going to miss a whole bunch. Rob Carrick, Jim Pasica, Glenn Carley, Glenn Urick. Like, there's so many CEOs on that floor from 1991 that turned out 10 years later, 15 years later. It's incredible. It just shows you the hiring practices at Saskoil and that. And so I, wasn't a known quantity. And so when I bumped into Paul and he was like, hey, he was at Impact Energy at the time. And he's like, hey, I'm going to do a startup. Do you want to get together? And I was, yes, for sure. 100%. And I said, I have a deal. And he's like, oh, I'm talking to Ian Dundas and Gary Tanner and Rob Carrick, he was the engineer on our floor. And so why don't we talk to them about your deal and we'll raise money. And so we met with them and they were going to lend us, it was a $9 million deal. They were going to lend us $8 million and we'd put $1 million of equity in. And then we had to pay that money back by Christmas time in 6 months and give them a 25% rate of return. And we were going to take Crescent Point public and do a flow through AB and raise $9 million. And so that was the plan. And so I'm negotiating with Ian and I said, well, what if El Paso, that's who the fund was. What if El Paso goes under and you then just swipe the loan and we lose 100% of our equity? I was putting in $250,000, which is basically the money I made at Machen. And of course I didn't learn roll all of it in and rebet on yourself. And so, people listening, that not many people do that, re-up and put all their money in. It was 2x my mortgage. And so I was looking at every way that I wouldn't lose this money. And he's like laughing, like, well, we're a $50 billion company. Like, we're not going under. And I said, well, what if you lose your job? What if you decide to switch jobs. And now I'm talking to a guy in Houston, and so he was like, thought about it, and, if Ian thinks, and they said, okay, we'll match your equity. So they put in $1 million of equity. We put in $1 million of equity. It was myself and Paul and 2 other guys. And we created this company called 935247, Alberta Limited. And that was the private co. And I hired Kevin McGilvery, who was my field operations guy from Machen out in Provost, to run it. And Dave Balutis came along, and we grew production and did optimizations and fought through it all. And then we were into October or into September, and then 9/11 happened, and oil went from $26 to $17. But we were able to keep production and keep everything together. And we rolled that company into Crescent Point on October 21st, 2001, which is the date of my second son, Kellen's birthday. And that's why I always remember that exact date. But, and we did a flow through AB, Paul as CEO, myself as a vice president, production. And that was this, start of Crescent Point. And if you remember, in that time period, Enron scandal happened. And so Enron was selling power and natural gas, and that whole period from 2000 January to June, everybody was selling oil assets and buying gas assets because gas prices were high, and the U.S. guys were coming up trying to find gas. And that's how NC Petrofund bought us, and we're looking for gas. And then the bubble kind of burst with the 9/11 and then the Enron scandal. And a year later, I got invited to the Enterplus golf tournament, which Ian was part of, because El Paso collapsed. It went from a $50 share price to $2. They almost went bankrupt. They shut down the venture fund, and Ian and Gary moved over to run Enterplus. And literally a year on the day, they were in a different company and running a different thing. And we'd already done a couple deals and financings and grown, to a couple thousand barrels a day, I think, by that time. And we did some other unique deals. And then the other side to that note is when we did the deal with Rio Alto, if anybody recalls, Murray Edwards on the board of Rio Alto, and it went to their board to get approval. And the message came back, yeah, we'll do the deal, but I need to get founder stock in Crescent Point because Scott took founder stock from us in Penn West when we did our deal 10 years ago. And so I want to have equity in the deal as well. And that's gives you the credit of Murray and how smart he is to remember and have that kind of level of detail in behind. So he's like one of the original founders, as founding stock in Crescent Point, from that original deal with Rio Alto. So it's an interesting story from that regard. So,
Paul was very generous with his time on this podcast. So it's another connection in common. But although you did well at Crescent Point through the years and whatnot financially, do you think that the fact that you had to double your mortgage and take the personal and financial risk is sometimes lost in that whole story?
Oh yeah. Like I never got paid for the first year there.
Exactly.
And this is plus and minus with Paul and us. And what we did is that we gave that founder stock to everybody. So I put in a big chunk on the private co, took all the risk, my operator, my deal, all that stuff. And then we gave, small, like 25 grand here, 25 grand there to friends and things of that founder stock. So I didn't get that big founder position and then even then, because we did that growth and I printed it off a chart, 2001 to 2003, we grew Crescent Point, big win, 25 cents to $6 a share. I have it laminated. And this is the brilliance, I think, and people don't probably give Paul as much credit for any of this stuff, but we were the first to do a trust combination with a junior and then spin out into a trust and a spinco. Well, 35 companies copied that after us. And, that's 100% Paul. And so in 2003, I took over as CEO of the trust, hand out all your cash, and then a spinco. And I convinced Trent Yanko at the time to sell his company into Starpoint. Paul ran it, jumped over, and he had this, shorter time viewpoint. And we all did. I only wanted to run a company 3 years and then flip it and run it for 3 years and flip it. And that was Paul's mindset. And that's how you make money. And so he jumped into Starpoint. I took over, I was honored for him to ask me to jump in and run as a CEO, and we put a great board together and then went out. And so people kind of don't see that. And because I was a new CEO in a new entity, and we had a big win from the split out and then shockingly big win in the SpinCo, I didn't ask for a lot of money. I didn't fight on the comp side because I just wanted to be, get to that next position and a CEO. So we went from 100 million market cap or whatever to $1 billion. And I never got paid anything for that time period. And I was really low in the comp tables on everything and all that kind of stuff. And that really kind of was the roots of some of the issues that later happened with compensation and things that, it's all paper money. It's not really real. My cost base at Crescent Point was $32. So that tells you something and we handed out $7.5 billion of dividends. People forget the amount of dividends we handed out. I think Whitecap to date has handed out maybe $1 billion of dividends, $1.2 billion. We handed out, with including up to date, probably now $8 billion or more dividends. So that gets lost in the shuffle of the trust world where we handed out 80% of our cash flow. But I don't know, jumping around a little bit, but it was a fun time. It was, challenging and but rewarding at the same time. And all through that time as well, even before that, I helped start up Harvest Energy Trust. And so people forget maybe about that, but it was early days, I think 2002, and there was an asset for sale. Paul brought it into the office from ConocoPhillips, maybe, I think it was, I can't remember. And it was this junky asset where you could draw a straight line and it was going to decline into zero in a few years. And so they were kind of, Bruce Chernoff was looking at financing it, and they were kind of humming and hawing, should we do this deal? Because we're going to pay like a half a time's cash flow. And so they gave it to me, and based on my background from Machen and our Sounding Lake and Provost, I knew that when it got to 95% oil cut, these pools just flatline over. And they produce for years and years and years afterwards. And so I was like, this is unbelievable. I guarantee you in the next 6 months, this thing's going to flatten out. And that oil cut from 95% down to 99 is going to take years and years and years. And yeah, we should do it. So they not only did it paid only half a year's time. So it was like a 30 million a year cash flow. They had to come up with maybe 20 million, and we levered it up completely and only put in, I think Bruce might have put in 5 million or something. And so he came to me, and I'll never forget it too. Kevin Bennett, I think, was involved. He was on our board, and he comes up and he's like, Scott, it's your deal. Like, you could take as much as you want. And I was like, well, I'm all in at Crescent Point. I have 50 grand in my wife's RSP. I think I could put that. And he's like, sure, do you want 75 or 100? Or I'm like, no, that's all I got. Like, I don't have any, I'm mortgaged to the, And so I put in 50 grand. That 50 grand, I sold the stock at $45, I think equivalent with dividends. And we got in at $1. And so it was, that RSP turned into like almost $2 million or something. It's insane. And so that's Harvest. I mean, and we did 3 deals, like on the exact same thesis, back to back to back. And they were 20,000 barrels a day. Jake Rorda, I think, came in, and they were in our office for a period of time, and then they spun out. So we were able to do kind of deals like that. And that sort of brings you to this sort of world we're in today, right? You got to look for things that people don't see, obvious things that people don't see, and to make money. And, that's sort of one example, but.
It's easy to look back and say how well Scott did financially, like we mentioned, but it's lost the fact that the risk you had to take at the time, the mortgage debt and the entrepreneurial risk, I guess.
Yeah, it's all calculated risks, right? Of believing in yourself and believing in, the technical concept. I mean, Cash Island's no different. We were able to land an acquisition in the down, COVID. You look at it, really experienced teams. Guys like Neil Roselle, Rick McCarty, Fotis, Mike Rose, Murray Edwards, put ourselves in that category. We all looked at COVID as the greatest opportunity in the world. And we all did deals and acquired in the low of the low. And if you look at who's been the most successful in this short period of time, it was those experienced teams that had lived. I lived 1998. So you have to live that once, and you hopefully only live it once, and realize, holy crap, and then realize the opportunity to acquire and be in that low and take advantage of it. And when we did, I mean, at Machen, we were able to do an acquisition in the low, that saved us and got us out to come out the other end. And so as soon as that happened, it was like, wow, this is an opportunity. And we worked our butts off to try to get a deal through that time period. And we were successful in acquiring the Medicine Hat property. And then at the same time, we had this concept again of a different technical view on the Bakken. And so the Bakken, in this northern area where we're at, the wells would frack out into the water and the wells wouldn't produce very well. Well, open hole drilling, which we had done actually in the Bakken, and how it actually started was open hole, produced wells and produced oil. And there were wells up in the north that we actually were open hole, but with the changeover of engineers and the people and in the companies around those lands disappeared, people forgot that technical knowledge. And so when the downturn happened, that's when we stepped on the gas to buy the land. And we were able to pick up 2 townships of land for almost nothing through that time period, and then test out multi-leg open hole drilling in the Bakken. And it proved out that it works, which we knew it would, but you have to do it. And now I don't know how many wells in. We're now partnered with Varen in a lot of wells out there and intertwined, ourselves with Saturn as well. And it's worked out really well. And so those are the kind of things in these, so in that downturn, we just thought that is such a great opportunity, to thrive and grow.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info@conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This episode is brought to you by pipelineonline.ca. Pipeline Online is Saskatchewan's energy news, providing comprehensive coverage on oil and gas, power production including coal, natural gas, geothermal, wind, solar, and nuclear. Pipeline Online now also provides coverage on emerging lithium and helium plays. No other publication matches the quality of Saskatchewan energy coverage. Find it all at pipelineonline.ca. The collection of people between you and Paul and Trent and Murray Mason, Brett Herman, all the others, kind of like the Remington Renaissance sort of feel to it.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was? What is it? Someone hiring everybody? What was unique about that situation?
I think we all, and I have to say this, I had great mentors going through that, Glenn, Jim Pasica, Paul Coburn, great mentor, Peter Bannister, and good, strong hiring and mentoring of those younger. And, that's one of the legacies that I see for Crescent Point and Varen is that, at Varen right now, there's probably half a dozen CEOs sitting there working away, right? There's already several that have come out of there. Chris Bergengate did a great job with Bonavista, Chad Lundberg at Baytex, one of the top technical people out there. And it's just, we had this plan from day one as Crescent Point that I wanted, that would be the success of it, is bringing in students, training them, getting them to the technical level and knowledge, and incorporating them within the culture. I'd have summer students presenting to the board all the way up, junior engineers. We had manager meetings, week over week manager meetings that we brought in separate groups, engineer, landman, accountant that were juniors to sit in the manager's meeting to hear how we made decisions. We made all of our decisions in that manager's meeting. They didn't get made anywhere else. And that created this big communication and culture that was positive, that gave all these guys this great experience to know how we made decisions and when and why. And that came from when I was at Newmac. Every Wednesday they'd have their management meeting. The doors would all be closed. All the execs would disappear. And you had this you'd get this sort of weird feeling of like, what's coming out of that meeting? Like you didn't know ever what was going to happen. And so I didn't want to have that feeling for people within the company. I wanted them to know what was going on, buy into the company, be part of the decisions, and make decisions together so that if things went wrong, we were in it together, and create our own culture that had that. And, sometimes there's bad things about that things get leaked, or maybe somebody finds but at the end of the day, those kind of things are minor, don't mean anything, versus having everybody involved in decision and learning. And so then that engineer, when they get promoted and go, they become more and more knowledgeable, and then they go off like a Chad or a Chris, and they can really do great things at another company. And I never ever expected anybody to be there forever. And I wanted to see that, just like you mentioned, Renaissance guys, they're proud of their culture and what they created and how they built companies. And I wanted to have that kind of same view for people from Crescent Point. And so that you looked at somebody's resume and said, hey, that person's from Crescent Point. They must be really well trained and knowledgeable. And I think that's the case now, and still is the case. So.
Do you think it's possible to train the entrepreneurial skill set, or do you have to start from square one? It's kind of comes from within. For instance, you and Paul were the ones who started these companies, versus some people work their way up in the company, maybe go off on their own. But do you think it's a learnable skill set, or do you have to start as an entrepreneur organically?
I definitely, you need mentors. And I think anybody that's going to do a startup should have a mentor. And so I mentor in 2 programs. I'm a chief mentor at Endless Frontiers Lab out of New York University Stern Business School. And it's an incubator for startup tech, deep tech, digital tech, and health companies. And so I meet 75 new companies every year. I mentor 4 or 5 of them. And it's always answering the same sort of things. And so these programs are really good. Y Combinator is a competitor. Creative Destructive Lab, I'm also a mentor of in Calgary. And I did mentoring in Paris Heck. Again, in the energy stream in Calgary. In Paris Heck, I did climate change companies. And so it's a very common theme and questions and things of all of these startups that come through the program. And some of them are just simple things that we implemented, and Paul does every day and I do every day. And I'm like having just a simple Wednesday meeting that you cover everything in the business in front of everybody with your people so that everybody knows what's going on and you can make decisions. Sometimes that's like just a simple thing. A lot of these MBA programs and entrepreneur programs and that teach these 2-week sprints and all this kind of language. And it gets just distracting. It's like too many meetings and too many things. And you if you can bound everything together in a Wednesday meeting and go through top to bottom the company and make decisions and communicate. And then at the end of the day, we did surveys every year, and we got like 95% survey rate and pluses and all that. And it was all communication. It's like 100% communication. And all these startups that I do, it's a lot of times it's just communication between founders. And so you can become an entrepreneur. It's not you're not born as an entrepreneur. You have to learn it just like anything else. And I would say the big, surround yourself with good, strong mentors. And I used to always say, I love, the old saying is, learn from your mistakes or whatever. And I used to be like, no, I want to learn from other people's mistakes and not make any mistakes. And in this industry, if you miss your numbers for a quarter, you're dead for a year, probably 2 years. We never missed a quarter in our entire 18 years. I don't think Paul has ever missed a quarter in his history. And it was drilled into me to have those meetings and get ahead of your production numbers, make sure that you never, ever have to make an excuse. And that's difficult to do. And at the end of the day, right now in this world we live in, every single company that's out there right now in the energy industry is a top company. Like there's no B companies that I know of. Like there might be 1 or 2, maybe, but you're now arguing over the best of the best. Back when we were, in the 2000s, I think there was like 35 or 40 trust companies. So you could distinguish between good and bad and lay them all out. And now there isn't any. They're all the best of the best and the best teams. And so you can't really falter in that environment. You couldn't falter before, but you certainly can't now. And so that's having that kind of communication as an entrepreneur and in these businesses, and knowing you have 6 months to live and you got to get to the next thing. And these programs are really good for that, of helping companies. And we probably should, as a energy industry, have a similar energy, startup mentoring program, because to me, I don't think I'd be anywhere near where I'd be if it wasn't for all the mentors that I had, and great friends like Neil Roselle or Ian, and that you could share experiences with and learn from.
Circa 2001/2002, Crescent Point share price was on the public markets about $2-3. By 2011, it was about $50. Although you had the tailwind of rising oil prices, there were other energy companies in the space at that time that didn't have as much success. What do you think contributed to the success of Crescent Point that made you different?
Yeah, I mean, we had a 10-year run that we were the top probably performing stock for 10 years. And obviously, we had, and I look back at the charts, like the oil prices went up and down. We had all these mini downturns, things like that. This was in our presentation, and it is today. And this is what every presentation I see out there is proven management team, excellent balance sheet, high quality reserve base. If you don't have all three of those things, then you're not going to outperform. And any one of those things missing. So if you have an inexperienced team and you have great balance sheet and great assets, that inexperienced team's going to make bad decisions and it's not going to work. If you have a stretched balance sheet, you're going to make bad decisions to compensate, for what you're doing. If you have poor assets, and a great balance sheet and great team, you're going to do weird things to try to make it work and take risks that you don't really need to. And so each of those three things have to be there to be successful. And that's what we were through that whole period. And my whole time at Crescent Point, we were hedged out 3.5 years going into the downturn in 2015 when oil dropped from $100 to $25 or whatever it was. And so we were well protected. Yeah, we had to cut our dividend, but the company was there. It wasn't our fault. Oil dropped from 100 to 25, and every company got hammered through that time period. So, but we protected the balance sheet and protected the company through hedging, and then looked to acquire and grow through that downturn. And, we grew every single year as a company in the 18 years that I was there, and 90% oil weighted. And so we stood out differently than others. And I think it was 2005, we're gas guys. And I think I made a comment of, gas is a byproduct, and someday we'll pipe it to our homes and heat houses, and someday we'll run it to run power. And someday we're still doing that. Like, it's just, I think AECO was 20 cents or whatever not too long ago. It's almost air now. And so we were a distinguishing difference being an oil weighted, 90% oil weighted, all through that time period where gas was just pummeled. And it still is pummeled as we speak today, and will so, because guys are chasing liquids for the gas. And so you're producing all this gas. I don't understand it right now that we're not, as a province, doing something to mitigate gas production, or having the same mindset that we did with oil when oil differentials widened and they kind of stepped in for a bit. Why are we giving our gas away for 20 cents? Like, it makes no sense. There should be something that we should be looking at to carve back our production, or the producers should be, and get that price. But we're chasing liquids, and high oil prices mean low gas prices because of the inverse, that relationship. And that'll be for a while until, we get LNG and more offtake. But that's probably a whole nother podcast. I can talk to oil and gas versus, and so I'm an oil guy. I'm an oil believer. We looked at Chevron, looked at some of these gas assets, and, they run out of inventory really quickly at a fast pace. Whereas oil, you can water flood it. You can increase the recovery. There's assets we had that had been producing since the 1940s, and long life, low decline. And so our whole main thesis as a company was this small little change in recovery factor over time outperformed others. And so if you own those big oil assets, and you can change the water injection, you can infill drill a well, you can change the pattern, recovery factors, instead of being 20%, could get to 30, 40, 50%. And we had analog pools that have recovered 50%. And we have all these pools that are only at 20%. Who cares about drilling inventory? We're all focused on drilling inventory. Well, I don't care. If I have 20% recovery factor and I can take it to 40, I don't have to drill anything. All of a sudden I have all this free cash flow. All that free cash flow then goes to pay the dividend. And so we're caught up in this financial world right now, and we've lost a lot of the operation perspective from the financial guys that are in Toronto. Like there's now almost nobody investing in oil and gas in Toronto. It's like down to a handful of guys, and their financial guys by and large have no concept of operations and what asset's better than another. And so it becomes this statistical math. And that's when I entered the industry as a CEO, as a royalty trust, going to the conferences. And I remember sitting there going, my presentation sucks. How can I do this? And I was super nervous to get up and talk. Paul laughs at me about it, but the guys would present and be like, our OpEx is $8. It's $2 lower than the average of the industry. Or another guy would stand up, our royalties are lower than everybody because we own the land. Our G&A is lower than everybody. So everybody would look at a financial statistic to show them how different and better they were than the other company. There was no distinguishing between assets. And I stood up and I was like, well, I didn't even have a financial slide comparing any other company. I just we have big oil in place. Small change in recovery factor over time will increase our reserves and increase value. And we don't have to spend a lot of money to do it. And we'll have a lot of free cash flow, and we'll grow our base and production. And even if we just maintain our production and increase our recovery factor over time, you're adding a massive, tremendous wedge of value without spending any capital. It's the greatest place to be in the world. And people looked at me like, what? And it became a new mantra for many years. And I remember John Dilward, I think, copied my slide and put it up the next year with ARC. And so it changed over for a period of time to be in operations and who were the best operators. And then we got into the Bakken and into multi-stage fracking and that kind of thing, and big resources. And it took a while, but eventually everybody has the resource. So like a gas guy, I remember Painted Pony, had a TCF of gas reserves. If Painted Pony has a TCF of gas reserves, like everybody does. And so then it became everywhere. So then people just went, well, everybody has it. And so now there's been no distinction between asset classes. Although when you actually take a step back, the best performers are oil guys, CNRL, Suncor, the rare, Mike Rose obviously is a god, and they should have parades for him probably every year for how successful he's been. But that's, there's not as many in that phase. And the Permian, those are the great companies, the oil companies. I would argue now the assets that we convert, the Clearwater where they're doing water flooding and the long life and longevity, that model will be very strong relative to a gas company and like the Spurs of the world. That I'm an oil guy, so I'll defend oil over gas all the time, but that's starting to probably, or will kind of change as people run out of inventory. And it hasn't got there yet. It's probably a couple years away, but you'll start to see that inventory disappear.
To do good work, you have to enjoy the process, the day-to-day, showing up to the office every day. To be good at it, what process do you enjoy at Cash Island now and through the years at Crescent Point? Well,
it's the same, it's the same. We're surrounded with great people, Neil Smith, Tamara McDonald, Greg Tisdale, really smart people around me, and that pursuit of chasing the drilling. I've got Ayaz, Gil Assam, and my son working with me, Graham, and Carolee Pierce, and Tamara McDonald, and Kevin's one of our field guys. We have a fun group, and it's great getting up in the morning, getting into work and meeting people and being with people that you really enjoy working with and can communicate with and have fun with. And it's really up to you, if you start a company or if you're running your company, to run the culture the way you want. Like, don't try to copy Cenovus. You're not Cenovus. Don't try to copy CNRL. Do what you want to do as your company that makes it fun to be there. Crescent Point, we had that mindset of let's do things our way as a company and how we want to be together. And so that's different than others. And I'm not saying other people are wrong of what they do. Just do what you believe. And so I really enjoy coming in. And, as a small company, it's fun little startup. And we have 3 or 4 other small startup companies on our floor that we intermix with. And so it's great atmosphere. We're drilling wells. It's a lot of fun.
Finding oil.
Yeah.
You're creative. Do you think that helped at Crescent Point through the years, looking at things differently and approaching maps differently and just being creative in general?
Yeah, I think thinking outside the box and always questioning yourself, listening to others question you. Sometimes it might take a day if somebody tells you you're wrong or maybe that's not right. And I was bad for that. Sometimes it might take me a day to think it through and then come back and think differently. And so those kind of things, having, again, as a CEO, I would talk to the junior engineer or the senior engineer that did the evaluation and grill them and go through questions. And we had some really fun times going through that process and learning what they're doing and what's working and what's not. Some people outside might look at that as, oh, you're micromanaging, like you should just be talking to your VP or you should just be talking to your manager and let them. And I was never that. I hated that as a junior, that I gave it my work to a manager and then the manager gave it to a VP and then the VP told the CEO and it was like telephone. And so I learned that early on in my career that doesn't work. And so I wanted to bring the experience in. And did I hurt, sometimes as CEO, you're like rough, right? Like, well, that's not right. That evaluation isn't right. And they get, and I learned I'll never forget it. Glenn Urick had this at Sask Oil. I would put a presentation together. It was a table and Glenn would add up the numbers and check it while I'm presenting. And I remember one time I had a table was wrong. The number was wrong. And he just closed it up. Okay. It's wrong. We're not going to meet anymore. And it's the most embarrassing thing that could happen to you. But it was also one of the greatest things that happened to me because it forces you to be accurate, to make things correct, to be able to put communication together. And then at the same time, in Crescent Point, we would say, if you find a mistake after this evaluation, tell us right away. And there was one of the deals we did, it was Shaunavon deal. Brian Reneski, a good friend of mine now, and we play hockey together. He did evaluation and we had it all set to bid and we're about to put the bid out. And then the next day he came to me. He's like, I made a mistake in my spreadsheet. Like, we need to re-meet. I'm like, okay, we redid the number and then put out the right number. And you'd be hard pressed to find that in a culture in some of the companies today that would be that open to admit mistakes. And it saved the company in a lot of times when we're missing production numbers or things were going and we could add a rig and you know that stuff up front. And so, yeah, having that culture of openness and everything.
Crescent Point, through a series of deals through the years, fed the street, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But did you ever get nervous when valuations got high, maybe 100,000 flowing BOE, and did you have to step back and say to yourself, maybe we should second guess this? Or did you ever get nervous?
Well, those are rule of thumb financial numbers. So what we always did, so all the street would say something's worth $100. And so when we looked at a deal, we'd be like, okay, what do we think it's worth? Oh, it's worth $100. What's the downside? Oh, it's 80. Okay. If prices fall and all this kind of stuff, the worst case it's worth $80. And then we do all hey, what's the upside? What's the drilling? What's the recovery factor could be? What are all these things we could do to it? Oh, it's 300. And so we'd be like, okay, we'll do that deal. If it was 100 went to 120 and the downside was 80, we'd never do a deal like that ever on the face of the planet. We'd go in and bid. Somebody would bid 100, of course, right? And oh, that's a big number. And then we'd bid 105 and win it. And people would be like, you paid 100,000 a flowing barrel. That's crazy. Those math, that doesn't work. And we're like, well, it's worth 300 or 400 or 500. They just don't know it. And so I'll guarantee you, and we did 1,000 deals and Tamara tracked it and people like, ugh, and that's counting $1 million deal and a $2 million deal. But in general, all those deals, they had big upside, even ones that we did a deal that was $250 million with Petro Bakken at the time in the heart of the play. And there was so many drilling locations, and you would have looked at it and went, oh, well, there's no way that's a 10 bag or a whatever. Well, when we bought it, it was right when we went from packer system to sliding sleeve. And we were getting 50% higher production rates on our wells from sliding sleeve that, Petrobakken didn't know. And so we did that deal. It was a $250 million deal that people thought we paid the moon for, and it was actually worth $500 million. Then it was in the heart of the play that we unitized and water flooded. And that water flood, that pool's going to recover 40% recovery. Well, that's a $3 billion value. So we paid $250 for something that's worth $3 billion. I'll do that all day long. People yelling at me that I did too many deals or did a deal that I shouldn't have or whatever. Well, that's the underpinning valuation of the company, and that's the longevity. So, those are the kind of deals we did.
Do you find it was hard to explain it from a technical perspective? Oftentimes the financial people didn't see it from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that's the communication again of the CEO to the investors and laying that out. It's definitely tougher in this world because everybody just assumes they don't even want to see maps now. And I used to carry montages, we called them, which were our maps of each of the plays that we had and all the technical from top to bottom. And it was a technique that I came up with because every time I met as the engineer, the geologists would roll out their maps and nobody would look at my report. So I'd be like, I want somebody to look at my work. So I went and I just put it out on Excel and then printed it off as a map. And so that we could lay that out. And I'd put then the geologist map on it and some other stuff. So it forced everybody to kind of see the whole picture. And we use those historically for like 15 years to lay out the technical of what they are. And the number of meetings I went into later on that people are like, I don't want to see that. Like, I don't want to see what the technical is. I just want to know your financial numbers. And so it's definitely a tougher way to. And so when you do these kind of deals, it's hard to show that value proposition to people than maybe in the past.
The saying is, don't ask the barber whether you need a haircut. Did you ever have to make sure the M&A advice you were getting was accurate? Did you kind of have to stick to your own compass?
We never took any M&A advice. I guess that would be my advice. Like the bankers want a bank. And so we knew years in advance of acquisitions. Like we would have, if we announced a deal, it would have been a deal we'd been working on for 3-4 years or 2 years or longer. And we were in a different world then. We consolidated the Bakken. There was 25 deals just to consolidate that. I mean, the area is 24 townships big. It's massive. And we consolidated pretty much that whole area except for one company. So it's a lot of deals to do to consolidate that land base. Same with Shaunavon, same with the Viking, same with Swan Hills, Utah, North Dakota. I wish probably my biggest mistake was not being more aggressive acquiring in North Dakota when we first went in there. We should have been way more aggressive. We had data that other guys didn't have on completions, and we'd have been a way bigger company sooner. But we were so focused on consolidating Canada on the oil side, and we had a good value proposition there with water floods because it's shallower. So yeah, that's on the M&A side. And we had great bankers I worked with that were helpful on all that kind of stuff. But the deals were our deals, and not many things were brought to us that we were always the proactive one that knew the chess moves that we're going to make, ahead of time.
You parted ways with Crescent Point. Sometimes when somebody leaves a company they helped found, they kind of disappear into the sunset, but you were not coin operated, so to speak. So what motivates you nowadays, or what motivated you through the years?
Yeah. I mean, at that time, so I stepped down, we had a new baby. You interviewed Jenna, and I just felt after 18 years of running a company, and we had this great group of Craig and Ryan and Shelley and that top performing junior, they were a junior executive, but they were, the best in the city. And I just felt it was that time, and I wanted to do what I'm doing right now, which is have a private 1,000 barrel a day company that I can manage and manage my own time, have nobody to answer to. We don't have any shareholders. It's myself and our team are the shareholders. We didn't go fundraise. So it's a great place to be. And then I could pursue, I had started writing this book, Those We Carry. If you haven't bought it yet, you should buy it. It's on Amazon. I had started writing this book actually sort of that winter. and was really enjoying it on the side, obviously at night. And so it was just accumulation of things between the new baby, that. And so, yeah, I felt it was that time. Paul, had done it way before I did. And I have a couple friends that had done it way before I did that stepped down and did their own thing. And I just felt it was a good time. Yeah.
What motivates you now, though? Finding oil?
Well, I'm doing a lot of writing. I mean, I'm almost finished my third novel, first draft of my third novel. I'm about to start a fourth. It's a historical fiction World War I novel. And so I love doing that. It's that same muscle of, as an engineer, reservoir engineer, sitting at the computer at GeoScout or AccuMap and coming up with a new idea. And I'd sit there for 8 hours, like grinding away and loving it. And so writing, it's sort of that same feeling and doing that. And then I love mentoring. I mentor at NYU and mentor at Creative Destructive Lab and meet all kinds of great CEOs that are doing great things. We have a family office called Icebook that invests in those kind of things. We have 35 investments, and I sit on 6 boards from a lot of those companies that we mentored, and DISA Technology. It's a uranium company. I'd be amiss if I didn't mention Ironsight. It's the Uber of the oil industry. And if you haven't signed that company up to help you improve your capital efficiency, then you should jump on them. They're now hard in the Permian. They've got ExxonMobil, BP, Tourmaline, CNRL, all the top companies are using them. And then we just did a new startup called Impossible Sensing. It comes from Pablo, who is a NASA scientist, and he's got a measuring device anyway on the Mars lander rover. He did 2 missions with them, and he took that device and, with the help of Crescent Point, Baron, developed this 3-phase flow meter that will replace test separators in the industry. It's a huge game changer. And they're just testing it. They've tested it with Crescent Point, Varon. They've tested it with Tundra, Tyne, and they've got a few other companies, and they're going to market this next year with, on multiple units. And it's inexpensive, cheap, $25,000 or something like that, and way cheaper than a test separator, and it'll get real-time data. So there's things like that that just excite me. Yeah. I mean, you could tell just by me telling the story, but, so some great technology companies out there that I really enjoy being involved in. And so I arguably spend more time on the mentoring and that kind of thing between that and Cache Island. We drill a well. There's not much I need to do. Ayaz pretty much does all the work, and Graham, my son, and Carolee and Lisa in our accounting. And so I have more time to focus on those kind of things and learn and really enjoy that aspect of it.
How did you promote technical aspects of the business to make sure the right people came up so that you had a good succession plan instead of politicians rising? How did you think about that to make sure you had good people coming up?
Yeah, I think that open culture. So, if somebody had an issue with somebody above them or below, like they came to me or they came to and we worked it out. The whole idea was to work it out and be successful. It wasn't politics. It's let's work it out and be successful. That's the bottom line. And so we had a lot of that you kind of figured out who were the people that were there that were doing a great job. And then having that open dialogue to write to the board, to the executive, to see the evaluation. So we had a lot of companies have BD groups. We didn't have a BD group. Every group was a BD group. And so when the Southeast Saskatchewan team, we'd have a lineup of deals that we wanted to do or things that we saw value in. They did the evaluation. They made the budget for it. They were accountable for it. Everything flowed through to that team, and they did that acquisition. And then it was successful when they rolled it in. And so we didn't have a BD group. There was no need for a BD group because the whole company was that. And that, to me, you don't get forced a deal because that BD group, they're now in this world where they have to do a deal because they're there for that purpose, or they have to sell something. They're there for that purpose. And so they get a lot of pressures put on them, and then they put pressure on the CEO and the board to do a deal because they have this group, and it doesn't work. It's not in my mind anyway, we never did it that way. We always had, so that the teams, if they weren't doing deals, they were working on their asset and they managed it and did really well, and they built their budgets. And then if they saw something within the area, then they would capture it. And so I think that was a very well way to run and build that business. Yeah.
The purpose of a company is to make money, but not all revenue streams are the same quality.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at assets, what to you is high quality? Is it long life, oil weighted?
Yeah. I look at where you see that upside, like there's it's at 100, but you can turn it into 300 or 400. And that a lot of that is stuff that isn't as tangible, maybe like a recovery factor. Like, hey, it's saying the reserve report will tell me, and the reserve guys will say, oh, it's only going to ever get 25%. Well, there was some guy in 1955 that came up with this theory and built those formulas that are perfect models that say, oh, you can never recover more than 25%. And then 60 years goes by in that same field that reservoir engineer said only 25 is 50%. And now it might get 60%. And it's data and looking at data and analyzing data and knowing that. And so that's where there's real value. Gas is tough because it depletes and there's nothing you can do. Once water hits or once the gas is gone, it's gone. The pressure's gone. And so that's why I've been an oil guy. It's difficult and I still believe this, there'll be water floods in the Permian. There'll be water floods in North Dakota at some point because it'll get to some point where there's no choice. There's nothing left to do, but let's try it. And, the rock that we're doing in the Bakken is millidarcies. Like would theoretically shouldn't work, and it does.
Problem is sometimes you got to spend a lot of money to get the oil. Did you view it as the cheapest well possible to get the most oil out of it? Or were you interested in the Deep Basin? Maybe you were kind of getting into that in Crescent Point in the later years?
Well, yeah. I mean, we were looking at the Duvernay and that kind of side more as an add-on to what we had. Our biggest growth was Utah, and Utah, like you can't even describe it. 3,000 feet of pay. The oil in place there is massive. Multiple zones, like a dozen zones to drill up. And we proved it horizontally to be drilled and fracked. I can't imagine if you drilled it multi-leg, there's probably zones there to be done. But it's different players there, right? Now it's US guys that don't think that way. But yeah, that's where our big growth really was that basin. I still think there's a real opportunity there. And on the gas side, and this is where we always probably had this if you step back as investors or market people, is that, and I call them air barrels, and they literally are, is the gas guys can produce huge quantities of dollar per BOE because they got given to them a 6-to-1 ratio, which the 6-to-1 doesn't make any sense because the value pricing is not 6-to-1, it's 20-to-1. And so if you actually adjusted it for the value of that product, the gas guys are way lower BOE, right? And so that is missed in the financial world because we created the 6-to-1 ratio, and it should really be even 10-to-1 as a minimum right now, but it's probably 15-to-1 or 20-to-1. And so that muddies the water. So when people looked at our per share growth on a production per share, you're comparing apples and oranges. It wasn't the same. And so getting those air barrels to show growth on production, it's cash flow, right? At the end of the day that matters.
The nature of the energy industry is that it's volatile. The stereotype may be of a gunslinging oil man out east, but do you think price volatility has kept people in the energy sector humble?
Hedging, right, is what was our main leg of our stool. So that's why we hedged out 3.5 years. Nobody hedges. You look and they're hedged out a year. That's not a hedge. It's not a bet on anything. And so we hedged out 3.5 years to protect that long term, to reduce that volatility, to lock in our capital. And so those are the kind of things that build value in taking those bets. And okay, I had a 10-year run of high prices in that period, and I was able to lock in long term. And I never expected a downturn to be 2015 to 20 or whatever. Let's give it 5 years. But those are the kind of decisions, so the volatility you can manage if you have that mindset. And before I left Crescent Point, I went to the Citibank conference, and that was why I was hedging the way I was and fearful of price. Is Ed Morris, who's a brilliant guy, he's just retired now from Citibank. He was bang on in every forecast. He was like, oil's going to crater in the fall. And so we were hedging quite a bit to protect that downturn, and they showed this chart of who was hedged. And the first year, everybody's like clustered around the same 50% or some number. And then second year, there was maybe a handful of 1 or 2 dots. And then third year, and it was Crescent Point, only dot on the chart. And this is in the US, North America, every company. And so I know that we were the only guy out there that was hedged. And so those are kind of strategic decisions as a company that you reduce the volatility and create value long term. Or you have no debt. Cash Island, we have 0 debt. So we don't hedge. So we can ride the volatility and take price, when we can. But
never know what's coming down.
We made billions of dollars on our hedges. Billions. And, somebody out there right now will go back and go through all the yearly anniversaries and show that we made 0 money on our hedges. Because you will. You'll go back and it'll be plus or minus 100 million on either side. But we made billions because in the downturn, when we were fully hedged, companies around us cratered and we bought those companies. And that made us billions of dollars. So it's not directly you can make money on certain things. You can use it for tools to make you money. Hedging is, instead of selling an asset, I would argue hedge out then 2 years. If you're going to sell something for 2 times cash flow, hedge it out for 2 years. Protect the balance sheet and grow. So that's kind of been, I think people get caught up in the financial aspect of it versus the operation aspect of it.
Some reflection, staying humble, hedging out. You never know what's coming.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple questions from Twitter and then some lighter questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
Time. Question from Twitter. What's the future of smaller startups with management teams jumping on assets being sold off at larger companies? Do you think there's opportunity for smaller companies to start now?
Well, we're doing a new startup, so I have to say yes, called Sharptail. Similar strategy as Cash Island. Yeah, I mean, since COVID, there's been probably 20 new startups or more. So it's quite a robust industry right now for startups. Not a lot of capital out there, so it's like squeezing little bits of capital here and there. But I believe, there's going to be another cycle of companies selling assets and bigger ones focusing on larger assets, which is where it should, that's a natural cycle. I've been living it for 30 years. Every time I sit there and go, oh, there's going to be no more deals, there's deals. And they're good deals, for people to jump on that. Those companies, it's rightfully, they should be cleaning up their assets and moving to the next thing, right? And that's just the nature of our industry. And I think for sure, there's a market for, it'd be nice if the financial market, the funds in Toronto and were now followed that same view. And I'm hopeful that whoever works for Eric Nuttall or any of those other funds goes, I can do my own energy fund. I'm going to start up my own fund and raise money. And then that feeds the junior market. And there's another cycle of funds like that get built. Maybe that is the next phase. Hopefully I'm always optimistic on that end. Oil is going to be around forever. And I think it's a great place to oil and gas. And so I think there'd be great room for investors and for those smaller funds to come in.
How much of running a company is instinct? AKA, even if you gave someone a 10-point plan on how to rebuild Crescent Point, they couldn't do it.
Well, it's hard to recreate time and, I mean, there is a new renaissance right now, multi-leg drilling, right? So that's what's created all this new round of juniors. And I don't know. I mean, there is some great engineers out. Like I said, there's probably 6 CEOs in Varen right now that will come out in time and have that entrepreneurial part of it is, and it's just like writing a book, just do it and listen, find good mentors and do the best you can with some of these principles that you want to stay close to. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. I'll say we copied CNRL. He's never sold anything. He bought, he buys, he holds, he has great technical people. He's loyal to his staff. They're brilliant. Like, why wouldn't you don't reinvent the wheel, like follow what's worked. And, we followed somebody else's plan. Like, it's not rocket science. And I'm helping a rocket scientist build a rocket engine in one of our companies. So yeah.
Do you remember the day you woke up and you realized you owned part of an NHL team?
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, and I didn't go into my background, but so my first job was working for the Winnipeg Jets as a video coordinator.
I read that, yeah.
And I worked there 6 years, like it's crazy, all through like last year of high school and through all my 5 years of university. And I worked every night. And it wasn't until later, like years later, that I realized how much I learned from all those coaches. And Rick Bowness was one of my coaches. Bob Murdoch was probably one of the best coaches I worked for. And I got to sit in and listen to listen to them as leaders and motivators. And I did motivational videotapes for all the players. I did advanced scouting. I would watch Chicago play Detroit and put a 10-page report together in a video and give it to the coaches. And so I did all these kind of things that I had 6 years when I came in to take Neil's job, at Pasco. I had 6 years of experience and all this leadership sort of knowledge that I didn't really realize until later on as a CEO that I used. And when George Gosby phoned me, hey, do you want to invest in the Winnipeg? I know you worked for the Winnipeg Jets and they're Arizona and that's your team. And it was funny when I walked in the dressing room there and Stan Wilson he was the equipment manager when I was there and he was the equipment manager still 20 some years later. And so that was probably when it was like, holy crap, this is super cool. It was, if you ask Jenna, she used to shake her head. It was quite an experience. It's like, it was, definitely learned a lot about professional sports and the process there. So
did you approach it as a business venture? Because some, sports teams are actually really good businesses, or at the time was it more something you just enjoyed doing?
Yeah, I think because I was busy running a company, out of all of the other owners, I was probably more involved on the financial. I was the chair of the audit committee and I was more involved in the financial side of it and what was working, what wasn't, and the model. And so probably because I didn't have the time to go travel with the team and do a lot of the fun stuff. So I probably was more focused on that end. And so, and I was a hockey guy. I'm a hockey guy. I still play hockey. I had all that sort of video experience, like all that, 6 years in the NHL, being in the dressing room, sitting in with coaches. I traveled with them for playoffs. I have lots of stories on that kind of stuff. And I remember Bob Murdoch turned to me, he's like, you're going to write a book on this someday. And I'm writing some hockey stuff in there, my next book. So yeah, it was a great experience, and both as an owner and working there.
The arena's in Glendale. If it was in downtown Scottsdale, would it be better for the company?
I'd still be an owner of an NHL team.
If the arena was in Scottsdale.
Yeah. And they,
for listener, why is that?
We were so close we had a deal with the university to build a stadium at the university, and it was part of a bigger infrastructure bill that went to Senate, and they were going to squash the bill unless they pulled it out. And there was political pressure. They just never wanted an NHL team there. And they still don't to this day. And it's mostly Canadians that go to the game. At the time, we had 12,000 season ticket holders. 11,999 were from Scottsdale. There might have been one person from Glendale. Like, it was insane, the difference when we looked at it. And I had all those stats and everything. It was incredible. And so that's where the team needed to be. And it was not all Canadians, but it was a big piece of their fan base were Canadians, right? And we are also one ball away from Connor McDavid. So I remember sitting with Jenna and they pulled our ball, and then Edmonton went down to the last two. That, if we would have had Connor, for sure, we'd still own a NHL team. So, yeah.
Well, maybe a couple of questions to wrap it up on a later note. Best deal you've ever seen other than Crescent Point, or best investment? Maybe that Harvest one? Harvest
is up there, I would say. And because I never mentioned Jenna Kay, my wife.
Shout out to Jenna who did the podcast.
And, amazing investment. We raised barely any money, 25 shareholders, and she has killed it. She's a unicorn by any definition of a company. So I think, pretty proud of that. On the oil and gas side, any company, Neil Roselle related. And I was on a couple of his boards and helped him on those endeavors. Harvest, Yeah, Star Point. I mean, there's a few of those. We had a good run, I think, through 2014, 15.
And the book, Those We Carry.
Yeah.
To touch on it once again.
Yeah.
You can get it on Amazon, and you probably have your website.
Yeah, it's on Amazon. I have a website if you want to look at some of the other books I'm working on, Saxberg.com. Yeah, Those We Carry. It's $9.99 on Kindle, I think $17.98 on Amazon. So pretty inexpensive. All the money goes to the museum really to help promote Canadian history. And I think that's probably one of the things that probably the message the most is we just don't have enough Canadian history that's laid out there. Soldiers, real stories. This book is all the stories in here. It's fiction, but they're all based on true stories that happened. Maybe didn't happen to Arda, the main character, but they happened to somebody. And it follows the Canadian Lake Superior Regiment. There's a few other regiments in there as well. And then a young Dutch woman, Koos Vandenberg. I just flew over to Holland and gave them all the books and the family. And it was really well researched with them and their family. So I'm really happy about that. And I've got great reviews. Kirkus Review gave us a great 25% of the books only get this check, get it box. And my book received that. So I'm happy about that, and Can reads. So yeah, hopefully people really enjoy it.
Maybe to wrap up, advice to a 30-year-old Scott Saxberg.
Oh God. Listen, take on those mentors, just do it. I mean, I was taking that chance and taking that risk and knowing you always have a fallback. And it was a lot easier for me back then. I mean, I was making $60,000 a year. Like you can jump into a startup and if I lose all my money, it's like not a big deal. So when you're young and at that age and you have that, knowledge and you can surround yourself with really good mentors and people around you, then go do it. And don't be afraid to leap and take that shot. And I meet with lots of entrepreneurs and startups that are doing that and young. And yeah, that's the advice. And I give that advice, all these programs. There's some great companies that have come out of there that have matured and done it and grown as they've grown with the company. It's been a great run from where I was.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that covers everything. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add or.
No, I think that's great. Thank you very much.
If anyone's listening, buy Those We Carry and read it. I did. And it'll come within a couple of days on Amazon. So
great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yep.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. You can also subscribe to the podcast where your token of support is much appreciated. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.